Let's continue studying this request. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Jesus teaches us to pray this prayer. And when we pray this prayer, we learn not just that we are weak, but we learn a second thing, or Jesus teaches us to know a second thing, and that is to admit that our enemies are strong. Now, to admit that you're weak, which you have to admit in order to pray this prayer, that's humbling enough. But it can be especially difficult to acknowledge the second thing, not just that you're weak, but that your enemies, your spiritual enemies, are very strong. You maybe know how this goes, how hard it is to admit this second part. Imagine you're on a soccer team and you've played a number of matches against a couple of teams just right in your area. Teams, maybe you know some of the people on those teams, and you recognize that on your team you've got some weaknesses as a team. There are some things you need to work on. You recognize, you'd probably admit, yeah, we're not actually very good. We're not a very good soccer team. But on the other hand, you've also played these couple of other teams near you, and you can see that they've also got similar weaknesses, maybe not the same weaknesses, but they're also weak. And so it's hard to admit that you're weak, but only so hard when you can see that everybody else is in a similar situation. But then you start playing matches against a wider group of teams. You get into maybe some tournament, and you start to see teams that are actually really good, and that in comparison to your team are pretty fantastic. And it can be hard at that point to admit not just that you are weak, but that your enemies are strong. Taking that next step and admitting my problem is not just that I'm weak, my problem is that my enemies, and hopefully you're not calling your soccer opponents enemies, just call them opponents. But it can be hard to take that second step and admit not just that I'm weak, but that my enemies are strong. Well, that's what it means to pray this prayer. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. It means that we're admitting not just that we are weak, but we're admitting that our enemies are strong, our spiritual enemies. This is how we say it in the Heidelberg Catechism. We're admitting that our sworn enemies, the devil, the world, and our own flesh, never stop attacking us. The death of Jesus, which we remember on Good Friday, the death of Jesus on the cross is a time when we witness the strength of evil. The death of Jesus emphasizes how strong our evil enemies really are. Let me show you one way in which the story of Jesus dying on the cross emphasizes the strength of our spiritual enemies. Luke, the gospel writer, tells this story of Jesus dying on the cross, and as he does, Luke emphasizes that the people who watched Jesus die were overwhelmed often by seeing the strength of evil. First, Luke says this, and this is in Luke 23, verse 46. Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." When he had said this, he breathed his last. So Jesus died on that cross with a crowd watching, and what was the crowd's attitude? Well, you might think that the crowd's attitude, because the people in Jerusalem had been agitating, had been scheming to somehow take Jesus down for some time. Jesus faced a lot of opposition in his ministry. When he was tried by Pontius Pilate, by that Roman official, the crowds around Jesus, they shouted for Pontius Pilate to release Barabbas, this other criminal, so that Jesus could be put in his place. They shouted, "Crucify him, crucify him." You might think that the crowds that watched Jesus die on that cross would be maybe cheering or breathe a sigh of relief, would be happy to see that finally what they'd been working toward was accomplished. But instead, what Luke wants to show us is that the people who were there and saw Jesus die, many of them were not happy or relieved. Instead, they were overwhelmed by how strong evil was. They saw that it wasn't some kind of perverse victory for them, but it was a kind of victory. It was the awful strength of evil. Luke continues in verse 47, "The centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, surely this was a righteous man. Or as some other translations have it, surely this was the Son of God. The centurion, this Roman soldier, saw the strength of evil. He saw that when Jesus had died, evil had won a battle against the righteousness of God itself. The centurion was overwhelmed in a certain way. Luke continues with verse 48. When all the people who had gathered to witness this sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. So beating their breasts seems to have been kind of a sign of guilt. We see this in some other places in the Bible. So it seems that the crowd recognized that not only had Jesus died, but that they had a part in this in some way. It was as though they were maybe acknowledging that this evil which had done Jesus in, which had done this man in, this evil was their evil. The world that had led Jesus to this point, unjustly killing him, this was their world. They were involved in this. Luke continues, but all those who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. The people who knew Jesus, at the moment he died, they stood at a distance watching these things, and you can imagine how they felt. You can imagine the anguish that they felt. Their hearts were probably crushed by witnessing the strength of evil. So that's one of the ways that the story of Jesus being crucified and dying emphasizes that evil is strong. There's this powerful sense of sadness, this crushing weight at the end of the story. And it's the same crushing weight that we often feel when we look at the world that we live in. Because we see that in many ways, evil is strong. The things that are wrong in our world are strong, much stronger than we wish they would be. And this is something we need to be able to admit. We need to be able to admit not just that we are weak, but that the things that are wrong in our world, the evil in our world, is strong. And that's one of the things that Jesus is teaching us to know and believe when he teaches us to pray. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one.